Well, greetings. I think we'll get started. Again, my name is Stephan Haggard. I teach at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. And this seminar today is part of our Korea webinar series, which has been supported very generously by the Korea Foundation. So I think some of our Korea Foundation colleagues are on the webinar, and we look forward to hearing from you. Let me just say a few things about some of the webinars that are coming up. We get together on Monday at 4 p.m. San Diego time, which is 8 o'clock in Seoul on Tuesday, but please feel free to join us. We conceive of the webinar as combining an attention to academic research and also to policy dealing with the region and cutting across developments in both South and North Korea in economics and politics. So next week, we're going to have Sam Wilson, who's a very sharp policy analyst at the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation. He'll be talking about space policy in Korea and Japan. Aram Her is an assistant professor at the University of Missouri. She's been doing very interesting survey work on North Korean refugees in South Korea. Jung-Sung Yoo, a former colleague, directs the Korea Inequality Research Lab and has done great work on inequality in South Korea. He'll be talking about trends in inequality and what some of the new data shows. And then on November 9th, we'll have a panel on the North Korean economy with Byung-Young Kim, who's probably the top South Korean economist on the North Korean economy, Bill Brown, who spent years in the intelligence community, and myself, who I've done some work on the North Korean economy myself. And that will be another joint seminar with SNU. So let me just frame the discussion today briefly. I think that many of you know that Korea has been identified as one of the handful of cases that really did a particularly outstanding job in controlling the spread of COVID, using in part new legal authorities that sprang from its previous experience with infectious disease, but also the use of cell phone and other new technologies, and a particular strategy for controlling the virus. And before getting on, we were just talking about the numbers. South Korea is somewhere between a sixth and a seventh the size, just in terms of population, of the United States. They've had 25,000 total cases, and about 430 deaths. I looked at the outcome of today. The United States is about 43,000 cases today in one day with 300 deaths. So clearly it's an important effort that the South Korean government has made in stopping COVID, highly successful, and we're going to be interested in hearing some of the details of how they did that. I'm going to introduce my colleague Munseob Lee very briefly. He's going to start. He'll talk for about 15 minutes, and then he'll introduce Jungmin Lee, who's a professor at Seoul National University. Munseob has done outstanding work on small firms in Korea, but when COVID broke, he took advantage of some of the data to write a very interesting paper on control of COVID in South Korea. So Munseob, why don't you lead us off? If you have questions, put them in the Q&A. If they're urgent and I can interrupt the speaker, we'll do that. Otherwise, we'll have a good 30 minutes for Q&A after the two presentations. Munseob?
Okay, so Steph, thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. So for the next 15 minutes, I will give you the quick overview of the South Korea's macroeconomy during and after COVID-19. So South Korea has been successful in controlling the spread of the COVID-19, and Steph already gave you some remarkable numbers compared to the US. And the Korea's mitigation strategy has been summarized by 3 T's: the testing, tracing, and treatment. So aggressive testing and tracking have been effective in isolating the infected compared to the blanket lockdown, the most popular strategy that has been implemented in many other countries, including the US. In addition, The South Korea made the information public about the basic information about the confirmed cases and the detailed travel route for the past few days. That's the outcome of the contact tracing. So South Korea's tech and the privacy law protected the vulnerable more while preserving the economic stability during the pandemic. So that's the main argument from my own paper, the step just mentioned. Some of you already have seen my presentation in spring from the webinar series. If any of you are interested in, you can find the YouTube, the recording from our Korea Pacific program webpage. Even with this successful mitigation, effort, so South Korea couldn't avoid the economic recession. But we anticipate that the economy will recover gradually. So let me show you here the trend in the mobility of the people. So mobility went back to normal in May, though it has declined again recently with a slight increase in the number of the new cases. So the figure you are seeing, I want you to focus on just the blue dots. The x-axis is the timeline starting from the early February until the end of May, and the y-axis is the general degree of the mobility. So the measured by the cell phone data, tracking the people's movement across the multiple different neighborhoods within the city of Seoul. When the number of cases increased rapidly, say in the late February, March, and April, the general mobility of the people has declined by 10 to 20%. So naturally, people worked less and they consumed less. So especially the services, tourism, and so on, those non-tradable sectors has been hit a lot during the COVID-19 pandemic. But you see that the mobility index went back to normal in the May. And if you look at the mobility these days, that is not so much different from the previous years, the general mobility. Especially in February, March and April, the government has taken multiple measures to support the economy. And I believe those were appropriate and prompt enough. So there has been several support for businesses in terms of the loan and the guarantees. And there was a support for the household too. So the Korean citizens also got the stimulus payment around 300,000 per individual. And then that must have been spent in the specific sector and in the specific the neighborhood they live. And the monetary policy also has been accommodative. So the Bank of Korea cut the policy rate from 1.25% to 0.5%. And there has been 4 supplementary budgets so far. And since the 1960s, I mean, this is the first year for the Korean government to plan and implement the 4 supplementary budget within a single fiscal year. But even with this stimulation effort, again, the uncertainty remains high. So let me show you some number from the OECD Economic Outlook. So they provide the predicted GDP growth rate under 2 scenarios, because I mean, who knows what is going to be the dynamics of the pandemic. So they provide the GDP growth rate prediction under single hit scenario and then double hit scenario where there is a second wave. So my understanding of today, the Korea is kind of in the middle, but closer to the single hit scenario. So then roughly we can expect that the GDP growth rate is going to be around the -1% this year. And then the next year it is going to be around the 2%. I mean, roughly the kind of the medium number between these two. But then the question is, how do we interpret this 2%, the anticipated growth rate in the next year? So that's close to the average GDP growth rate in the US, but that's below the Korea's the average growth rate. And at the same time, it is not enough for the Korea to go back to the original growth trend. So there will be the recovery, but it will take time for the full recovery of the economy. I think the South Korea was kind of lucky in the sense of having the sound public finance before the COVID-19. So let me show you the government debt as the percent of the GDP. So that's the 2019, a year before the pandemic. So the government debt was much lower than the OECD average. So OECD average is 100, and then that's basically the level of the US government debt as the share of its GDP. But the Korea, the level of the government debt was below the 50%. So compared to the OECD countries, the Korea was basically having the lowest government debt the last year. So the South Korea had enough room to stimulate the economy to increase the government spending. So the government provided additional fiscal support to the economy, and it was sizable. So the 3 supplementary budgets so far, and now the 4th supplementary budget is being implemented. That was already the 3.1% of the GDP. And there was also additional financing support in terms of the loans and guarantees. That's actually even larger than that, the 10% of the GDP. But I mean, you should remind that those financing support is not all of them are the direct cost, because if all the loans are paid off, so then at the end, the government is basically paying nothing at the end. So as an outcome of this, the fiscal support, the budget balance will move from the surplus in the 2019, there was the 1% surplus, to the deficit in 2020. It is going to be around the 3% of the GDP. But I believe the stimulation policy has been appropriate and prompt enough, and then sound public finance provided the room to increase the government spending without the much concerns or the worries. But however, in the medium term and in the long term, the South Korea, including all other the advanced economies, are anticipating the budget deficit, mainly due to the population aging. So the medium term and the long term implications should be monitored carefully, but I think the South Korea has enough room enough buffer for this, the one time, the 1 year, the exceptional, the additional spending. So before concluding my talk, I want to basically make the last but not the least point, the very recent discussion about the green growth. I wonder if any of you living in Korea has experienced any improvement in the air quality during the COVID-19. So I already showed you the aggregate decline in the commuting flows. So in one of my paper with the GPS students, so we found that from the January to April in 2020, the PM10 and NO2 has declined by the 2%. Those are air pollution. So the air quality became a little bit better during the pandemic due to, or thanks to, the decline in the people's movement. But then the question is, can this temporary reduction have any persistent effect? I'm not that optimistic, because, so I think Jungmin will tell you more about these labor market consequences. Personally, I don't see much the permanent shift to the work from home in Korea. And at the same time, the 2% decline in air pollution was not enough for the Korean citizens to demand further for the blue sky after experiencing that. So I'm always skeptical about the persistent effect of this temporary reduction, but I do believe in US and in China, basically coming from either sources, I anticipate a little bit of the persistent effect of the temporary improvement in the air quality. So regardless of the pandemic, so the Green New Deal was one of the big agenda, the main agenda the President the Moon was pushing forward. So that's basically the focus is on the green transformation of city, the diffusion of the renewable energy and innovative ecosystem. I think those are the great direction. Those are the needed in the medium term and the long term. But I want to conclude my presentation by making the one policy suggestion. So I don't want the government to, I think the government shouldn't mix this short-term stimulation policy and the medium-term public investment. So there is the demand for the government spending. So it is tempting for the government to mix those and then push the medium-term and the long-term agenda along with the short-term stimulation policy. But this short-term stimulation policy should be targeting the weak part of the economy, small, medium-sized enterprises, and the low-skilled workers. But this industrial policy, I will call that as an industrial policy, that naturally targets the large-size corporation and high-skilled the workers. So that shouldn't be mixed. Okay, so let me wrap up my presentation here. Let me stop sharing my screen, and I'll be happy to answer to some of your questions after the Jungmin's presentation. Now let me introduce the Jungmin Lee, the next presenter. So Jungmin Lee is the professor at the Seoul National University, and he has more than 50 papers published in the prestigious journals. And he's the expert in the labor market issues and especially on the Korean economy in general, including some of his work on the North Korean economy. Okay, now Jungmin, now floor is yours. Yeah, why don't you share the screen?
Thank you for your nice introduction, and I really appreciate this opportunity to share my ongoing research about the Korean labor market during the pandemic. And I hope that we could continue this webinar series between UCSD and SNU. Okay, so my talk is by and large about the labor market in Korea during this COVID-19 crisis. And I'm going to talk about current conditions and some future challenges, in my opinion. And I think that my talk is very complementary to Munseob's presentation in the sense that Munseob introduced the background of the current crisis in Korea nicely. So I can focus on the labor market conditions now. So overview my talk is, so I'm going to report the current conditions of the Korean labor market since the outbreak of COVID-19 in January. We had first case in January, and we had the first wave in March, which was basically localized to the city in Korea. And then we have been very good and controlled very well the cases of COVID-19 until August. And we had a little bit of the second wave in August. And my talk is restricted to the period before the August peak, but because the labor market data are available until mid-August so far. So my results do not reflect the impact of this second peak. So I'm going to discuss later the future challenges we are facing. Okay, so data. I'm using an economically active population survey, which is monthly household survey. And this is like similar to the US current population survey. And the main purpose of the data is to basically obtain the labor market, basic labor market statistics such as the unemployment rate. So I'm going to examine the changes in the labor force composition since the COVID-19 outbreak. Okay, so basically the labor force is comprised of those in the labor market and those out of the labor market, and then there are employed and unemployed in the labor market, and we want to look at the temporarily laid off within the employed people. Okay, so I'm going to use data from 2015 to control for the trends, the labor market outcomes. And I control for time effects and demographic composition effect. And I'm going to focus on age 30 to 79 in 2020 because I'm using the data from 2015. So I have to restrict the age, the starting age to 30 because these people are age 25 in 2015. Okay, so the one weakness of my analysis is that I do not see the labor market outcomes for young people. I'm going to talk about that later a little bit. I assume the March is treatment time 1. I'm going to show you why this assumption is okay. And I will look at the heterogeneity by sex and age and education of workers. Okay, so this graph is the trend of head count of workers from 2017. These the 2020, the January and February, and if you compare the January and February in 2019 or 2018, 2017, so the head count, the trend is decreasing overall because we are focusing on the specific age, 30 to 79, and the head count of workers is decreasing. But the January and February, the 2020 is not really bad. The head count in January and February was on the trend. But however, the March and April, you see, they are clearly different from March and April's in 2017 and 2019. Okay, so this graph shows supports my assumption. The March 1st, March is the treatment time 1, okay? So the impact was big enough to break the previous trend, okay? So the 2020 trend is completely different from the trends in the previous years. Okay, so first, let me show you the employment rate by month. So this graph shows the estimates, the impact of on employment rate by month. So from March to August. Okay, so I'm not talking about the exact regression equations, but it's very simple. I just control for time effect and the group demographic group composition effects. Okay. And I got this estimates, and you can see this is like 1 percentage point in March. The employment rate is down, and then April is about 2 percentage point down. Okay, and afterwards we are recovering slowly. And in August it was like a 1.5 percentage point. Okay, so the employment rate dropped about like a 2 percentage point in April. And as if you remember the graph that Munseob showed in his slide, in his talk, the first wave was like the mobility was the lowest in the late February and early March, but the employment rate was down in April. So one possibility is there is a 1 month lag, or maybe this survey is conducted every like a 15th day of every month. So between March 15th and April 15th, maybe there was the lowest estimate between, but we don't really see that. Okay, so I decompose this effect into unemployment and out of labor force. But employment rate that is down, then those people should go to unemployment or out of labor force. Okay, so I found in Korea, in the case of Korea, the major channel is from unemployed, from employed to out of labor force. So we don't really have any effects, any substantial changes in unemployment rate. And even August, look at the August is actually lower than the trend, the unemployment rate. However, on the other hand, this right-hand side graph shows the effect on out of labor force, and the out of labor force actually higher from March to August. Okay, so the effect on unemployment was minimal. Okay, this is one of the reasons is unemployment insurance system. So why did people drop out of the labor force? I think the shock was larger for those workers who were not covered by the unemployment insurance system. So I divided the sample by the coverage, unemployment insurance coverage in 2019 before the shock, and this blue line is the estimate of the impact on those people with 20% or below unemployment insurance coverage. And on the other hand, the 60% or higher the unemployment insurance coverage, for those people, the impact was not really significant. So, and if we distinguish by gender, not surprisingly, the shock was larger for female workers. So the graph, the lower graph shows the impact on female workers, and the upper graph shows the impact on male workers. All these graphs are about employment rate. Okay, and so the shock was larger for female workers. I think this feature is almost universal across countries. So female workers suffer more the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis. And I want to point the impact is changing. The nature of the impact is changing in Korea. And the graph is a little bit complicated, but in the workforce, we have 6 groups: the regular workers, and the temporary workers, and the daily workers, and employer, and the self-employed, employed without employees, and the family workers. And if you compare the impacts on worker groups over months from March to August, you see in April, the most affected group was temporary workers in April, but the impact diminished from April to August for temporary workers. So the impact on temporary workers in August is minimal now. However, if you look at this black graph, black line, that is the impact on regular workers. The impact on regular workers was not significant in March, but it's getting larger. And in August, actually the major group which is affected by the crisis in terms of employment rate is the group of regular workers. So this, the nature of the crisis, the nature of the impact of COVID-19 is changing over time, and the impact is moving from the most vulnerable group of workers to the most stable workers, the most stable groups in workers in Korea. That's, I think, very interesting. And if you compare the impact, heterogeneous impact by education, we found similar patterns over time. The impact is moving from lower educated workers to higher educated workers. In April, you see the lower than high school degree, the workers was most affected in April. However, in August, now the college graduated workers, educated workers are the most affected in August. Okay. By age, you see the also the similar patterns. So in the beginning, in March and April, the workers who are affected most was like a 75 to 79, very old workers. Okay. However, the impact on these old workers diminished from since April, and then now the group of workers who is most affected by COVID-19 is like this red line, which is the group of workers, young workers between 30 and 34. Okay, so the effect is moving from older to younger workers. Okay, so this is the summary. Okay, so I think the main message of from the analysis of labor market consequences is the policy target should be adjusted over time because the nature of the crisis is changing significantly over time. Let me talk about the few challenges, future challenges in 3 minutes. Okay, so I want to point out the long-term impacts of this virus. Okay, so first I want to talk about the entry-level young workers. I cannot analyze the impact on entry-level young workers because of my the analysis method. However, I believe that the impact is large, substantial on these young workers. And we know from the literature in economics, the impacts at the beginning of their career is persistent over lifetime. So we should watch this group in the long term. And second point is school closure, the impact of school closures. And I think the career interruptions of women with the children will be a big issue even after this crisis. Okay, and also I want to point out the impact on children in the future. So I think that there should be some development impacts and inequality among school-age children. I have one research about the reduction of school week, the impact of the reduction of school week from 5 days to 5 days to 6 days to 5 days, and I found some unequal effects. So similarly, if we close the schools, then the inequality among school-age children should be worse. Okay? So this will be the big challenge in the future, even after the crisis. And the lower fertility rate, you know, we are experiencing very low fertility rates in Korea, but I expect at least next year, our fertility rate will be lower. So this graph shows the marriage rate this year and 2019, and we see some deficit in this year in terms of the marriage rate. So we are not sure they postpone their marriages or they permanently cancel their marriage, but I see some effects at least next year. Okay, this is my talk. Thank you.
Jungmin, that was really fascinating. If you can just stop sharing your slides, we'll open up. I have one question in the Q&A that I want to ask, but before I go to that question, Jungmin, I have a question for you about the transmission mechanisms because I'm a little puzzled. You know, in the U.S., you have this very large fall off in employment from the lockdowns. You have a sharp drop in consumer spending as a result. You actually have an increase in savings in April, which is then spent down, of course, as the crisis kind of morphs. But Korea avoided the large lockdowns, didn't have a large drop in employment, but nonetheless sees this 1% contraction in the economy. Is that as a result of external demand and Korea's reliance on foreign markets? What's the source of the contraction?
Oh, so we didn't implement the full-scale lockdowns, but still the schools were closed, and some businesses were closed, and the people tried to avoid risks. So as you see the mobility patterns, the mobility was down in April and May. So that I think that was still impact.
And that operates through consumer spending, I assume, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the external sector.
Yeah, so not for employment so much, but on consumer spending. Yeah.
Mhm.
Go ahead, Jungmin. Sorry.
Yeah, in terms of the external sector, I don't see any problem in export and import so far. Maybe some the adverse outcomes are coming, but still we are very good at exporting and importing so far.
Good, good. Well, I'll come back to this. Munseob, I want to turn to you. Wan He asks an interesting question, and I'll give away my political priors by saying I think I might agree with him in part. You made a very sharp distinction between short-term policy measures, and you justified those by focusing on the fiscal transfers on those that are most vulnerable. But you tried to draw a sharp line between short-term policy responses and medium-term policy measures, like doing spending on the Green New Deal or moving in some new direction. And can you say a little bit more about why you think those two should be separated so strongly? Wan He asks, sometimes such policy mixes are often suggested, that is combining short-term policy measures with medium-term measures in order to maximize or enhance the policy effects. I mean, this is a kind of wonkish macro question, but I think it does come up in many of the recovery plans, is what do you put into the recovery packages exactly?
Sure, that's a great question. So even though I drew the sharp line between the short-term policy and then the medium and long-term policy, I mean, there is no sharp line in the real world, the policy making, then the implementation, the procedure. So answering to the question, so first of all, it is really challenging to evaluate the effectiveness of the policy separately from the short-term policy and then the long-term policy. But okay, let me start from this. So the point I want you to make is that I don't find the reason why we need to revisit the size of the Green New Deal, the Digital New Deal, the size of the New Deals that has been proposed by the current administration. So I think the government should push forward two policies at the same time, but the pandemic is not really the giving me the reason to the increase or decrease the proposed or the planned the amount of spending on the new deals, because this stimulation policy is targeting the GDP level, and the new deals are targeting the GDP growth rate in the future. And this is really needed.
Through the investment channel, right?
Yeah, through the investment channel. And the South Korea has the history of the stream of the successful the industrial policies. I mean, starting from the 1970s, there was the support for the manufacturing, and then there was support for the ITs, and that has been successful. And I think still the South Korean the government can play a key role for the South Korea to transform its industry to the new industries. So, but I'm just making the point that should be the push it forward, independently and separately, looking at the unique and separate the policy target, which is the growth rate in the future.
Okay, great. Well, I don't have any other open questions, which means I get to ask more questions, if that's okay, or we can. I see one here coming in from Kyung-ho Lee. Kyung-ho, why don't I take your question? It says, in terms of heterogeneity of the impact, I think we can focus on differences across industries. Are there significant industry level differences in the labor market responses? So Jungmin, recall, you talked about age effects, you talk about regular and irregular workers, and broke it down by gender. But what about industry? Can you report anything you're seeing there?
Yeah, I have checked the heterogeneity by industry, and I found the impact, not surprisingly, impact is by and large concentrated in the services sector, particularly the restaurants and lodging industry. And on the other hand, the manufacturing was quite not really affected significantly. So I think that is consistent with our performance in the external sector, because manufacturing is basically in Korea a tradable sector. It depends on the export and import. So manufacturing is doing well, but the impact is highly concentrated in food and lodging industry.
I see. Yeah. Yeah, that's to be expected. That gets to that point about mobility. Stephen Zhu has a question, and it's one that sounds like it's coming from an international relations scholar, because we talk about these type of things. He asks, other than economic performance in absolute terms, does relative performance matter? How is South Korea doing compared to other Asian countries? And let me just add to that question a little bit. It looks like the trend growth rate, the equilibrium growth rate in Korea has fallen over the last decade. How do you see that playing out? You suggested a potential, I think it was you, Munseob, for a quite rapid rebound in the low 3% range for 2021. That's above what South Korea's growth rate has been over the last 5 or 6 years, correct?
So that's under optimistic scenario. So if you take the median between the two scenarios, the GDP growth rate in the next year is predicted to be around the 2 to 2.5%. And the trend growth rate in Korea recently has been around the 3%, which is the 1% higher than the US, the GDP growth rate.
Oh, okay, so it's higher than I thought it was. I see.
Yeah.
So, but you're still not bouncing back to that in 2021 under the optimistic scenario even.
Right, so it'll take time for the economy to fully recover.
So that's interesting because the predicted, of course, these are all predicted. The predicted rebound in the United States is again, projection is quite large. In the range of 4 to maybe even 4.5%. Is that because the fall off was steeper? That's I assume is the reason.
Yeah, right? In this year, the GDP prediction in the US is the -4%. So -4% plus the +5% the next year. Yeah, we are basically going back to the level of the 2019. So missing 2% growth for 2 years.
Right.
But let me quickly answer to your previous question about the relative performance. So, I mean, the South Korea is the small open economy, and the South Korea is in the middle of the global supply chain. So I see that this is basically both the risk factor and at the same time the opportunity. So as Jungmin said, the export and import has been okay. I mean, thanks to the very quick economic recovery from the China. I mean, it was much quicker than everyone else expected. So then now the Korea's concern is basically whether we're going to see the rebound of the demand from the developed economies. So, I mean, let's see. So the US is anticipated to grow by 4% next year. Let's see how it goes.
Yeah, good. David Hickman asks an interesting question that I wanted to pose as well. So that's good for me. He says, you argue that government stimulus funds should largely go to small and medium enterprises, but it seems that the larger companies are the one most involved in vaccine research. Should stimulus money also be devoted to at least some industrial policy activities that are related immediately to the crisis itself? And again, if I can just add to that question a little bit, can you tell us more about the composition of spending? I mean, if we put aside what the Fed was doing in the United States, you had this extension of unemployment benefits in the United States, but then you have these loan programs to private sector firms, which ended up being quite confusing mess, frankly. I mean, it was very difficult to figure out where money was going and who was getting it and so on. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what Korea did on the fiscal side in terms of the nature of spending?
Okay, so on the fiscal side, there has been the four supplementary budget that has been planned and being implemented. And especially for the first supplementary budget, the Korea allocated a lot of money to the large size corporations developing vaccine and testing kits and so on. So I totally agree with the David Hickman's the point. So the sum of the money should be allocated to those large size corporations, basically to mitigate the spread of disease. And South Korea already did that. And from the second, third, and the fourth, the supplementary budget, the focus is more on providing the loans and guarantees to the vulnerable, the types of the firms that are hit a lot during this pandemic. And comparing to the US, I mean, the math is hard because how do we really calculate the potential cost coming from the unemployment insurance and some of the loans and guarantees? We never know for now how many of them are going to be deferred at the end. But in terms of the direct cost as a share of the GDP, the South Korea was basically spending kind of similar amount of the money as a share of the GDP compared to the US. That means, yeah, South Korean government has been spending a lot to the fight against the recession coming from this pandemic.
Interesting, interesting. Jungmin, I wanted to ask you a question about how you address some of the, what is the most efficient policy tools for addressing some of the changes in the labor market that you're seeing? I think people who are listening know there's long been a debate in Korea about the fate of regular workers versus contract workers that goes all the way back to the Asian financial crisis in 97, 98. And this gradual informalization of the labor market, more and more Korean workers either working on a daily basis or as temporary or contract workers. But then you're seeing that pattern replicated where it seems like regular workers are seeing the largest fall off in, I don't know if that was income or employment or both, but then you see this increase or bounce back among temporary and daily workers. How does that affect the fiscal policy mix?
So I think the finding that the impact is moving from temporary daily workers to regular workers is a warning sign because the impact is now going to the core the labor market, labor force. So it is actually quite difficult for the government to do anything for the labor market because I think the temporary workers, they are easy to lose their jobs. However, it is on the other hand, it is also easy to create the jobs for them because those jobs are not really do not need the technologies and high skills. However, the finding that the regular workers are affected recently means their firms and the more stable firms in Korea are now experiencing the consequences of COVID-19. So the Korean government should watch the performance of the medium-sized and large-sized firms from now.
Interesting. So we have a related question from Shu Peng, and this is also something that's very worrying in the United States. The number of people who are dropping out of the labor market altogether is very elevated in the United States. So it's not that people are just unemployed, they don't seem to be seeking work. And Shu Peng asked, can you explain more on why there's been a lot of people moving out of the labor market altogether? That was one of the most interesting findings in your talk, I think, that you got this shift from employed to to out of the labor force. Who are those workers? How do we think about them?
Mm-hmm. I think there are two reasons. First, in the U.S., basically there is furlough, so meaning that they are temporarily out of the work and they are on the labor, the unemployment benefits, but they can return to their jobs after the crisis. But in Korea, we don't have that kind of feature in unemployment system. We don't have a furlough. So that means they are unemployed. Then after this unemployment insurance benefit period, then they have to go out of the labor force. So that's one reason. And the second reason is our low coverage of unemployment insurance. The staff pointed out the regular workers versus temporary daily workers. The regular workers, the unemployment insurance coverage is over like 85%, about 85%, so it's just not bad. But for temporary and daily workers, it's just like 40%
Right.
or so. So they don't really have unemployment insurance. So basically, if they lose their jobs, then they have to go out of the labor force, or they have to get new jobs quickly.
Why is the coverage of, why is unemployment insurance coverage for temporary workers so low? I mean, this has been a very disequalizing recession in the United States, but that outcome would seem to make things worse for lower income workers if you don't have strong unemployment coverage, at least in principle. I mean, it varies by state in the United States. At least in principle, workers do have access to the unemployment mechanisms at the state level in the United States, but you're suggesting as many as 40% of South Korean informal workers don't have access to unemployment insurance?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very good question, and maybe and it's a very timely question also, because the government is now trying to expand the unemployment insurance to those temporary and daily workers. One reason is the traditional unemployment insurance system, which where the employers and employees co-pay. That is the so the first some employees do not want to pay unemployment insurance in advance. So that is one reason, particularly temporary and daily workers. And the second reason is we have the new types of employment, like independent contract workers. So we have recently in COVID-19, we have a growing number of delivery workers, and the delivery workers are independent contractors. Independent contractors are basically self-employed, so that they are not covered by traditional unemployment insurance system. So they are out of labor force, out of the system. So they cannot get the unemployment insurance.
Right. So I think we can take two more questions here, and they're both good ones. I'll start with Wongun Sun. He asks to Jungmin, and I think this was implicit in your presentation, but it's worth revisiting. What is the nature of the most vulnerable workers in Korea in the wake of the pandemic? What is the profile? Can you give us a sense of the profile of the most vulnerable workers? There were some surprises there to me. For example, it seemed like younger workers were actually vulnerable. You typically think of older workers maybe as being the first to face constraints in this kind of crisis. Can you speak to that for a minute?
It's actually very difficult because my point of my talk is the impact of vulnerable workers in terms of this COVID-19, with respect to COVID-19, is changing over time. So I gave this kind of a talk in April, And at the time, I said the older workers and the lower educated workers, those who were hit hardest by the COVID-19. But now I think we have a completely different story. So it's actually it's difficult to say who are the most vulnerable, and it's a very interesting topic why the impact is moving this way.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good question, Won-gun. I think he caught on something very important you're saying is this moving target. And finally, a question from Yongjang So. I think it was you, Munseob, you painted a fairly optimistic picture about Korea's fiscal space because government debt is relatively low by OECD standards. But Yongjang is asking about the growth rate in public sector debt and what's happening there. And he says, yes, the level of debt is still way below the OECD average, and I should say way below the United States, less than half as a share of GDP. But what about the trajectory going forward? Are there any concerns about Korea moving into a somewhat higher debt mode?
Yeah, that's a great question, and definitely there is the concern in the future. So that's coming from the decline in the revenue because South Korea is now approaching to the frontier economy. So we are anticipating the even lower the long-term economic growth rate. And at the same time, the increase in the spending, coming from the pensions, the healthcare, and so on. So that's why in the medium term and the longer term, sure, the level of the government that should be monitored carefully. And there is no easy solution. And that's also the common issue for all the advanced economies, including the US. So first of all, yes, the spending plan, especially on the pension and the universal healthcare system, may need to be revisited. And the fundamental way of the reducing the government, that is the boosting the long-term growth. But again, there is no easy solution. But I want to basically emphasize once again that even though the Korea today has the enough fiscal space, but the medium term, the long term, the consequences should be monitored carefully.
Well, I can't help just asking if you can just answer with a couple of sentences on this. I'm sounding like one of those reporters. Can you say something about trends in private debt, private household debt, and corporate debt? Have those been moving? Have those been moving up? I would assume they would be.
So the current corporate debt is similar to the OECD average, but the household debt is the problematic. That's, if I remember correctly, that's almost twice larger than the OECD average, and that's mostly coming from the household debt. Basically having the debt to purchase the apartment. So, it's the worrisome. So before the pandemic, I was anticipating that what is the source of the recession in the Korean economy, and my answer has been the household debt. Still, the risk is there. So it is getting the less attention during the pandemic, but I want to say that still the risk is there.
Great. Well, listen, this was a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. I want to thank the Korea Foundation, Munseob and Jungmin, obviously, but I also want to thank Kyung-ho, Stephen, David, Shupang, Yongjang So, Won-gun Sun for very good and perceptive questions. We hope you join us next week for our next webinar. And with that, I think we'll sign off. Thanks very much to SNU for supporting this venture, Jungmin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
See you next week. Bye.